snail, so there's a turtle, there's a snail on the turtle's head. What did the snail say?
Thank you, turtle.
One possibility, probably said it.
Hurry up.
He said, "Whee!" It's all about perspective. Okay, so I want to invite you, first of all, to think about law in the world around us. And so come with me. Let's look around. Take a couple of minutes and let's reflect on the law in your world. So as an individual, as a family, as a community, a parish, a worker, and as a citizen. So there's formal law. That's the most visible stuff. That's the stuff that we're most familiar with. It could be in the way of speeding tickets, just saying. Could be family law, could be immigration law, could be laws relating to voting, legal actions, contracts, laws that imprison us, or enables us to own property in a particular kind of way, that govern our unions, heterosexual or otherwise oriented, or as Glenn said last night, laws that govern our direct political action in various ways. He said that sometimes when there are laws that are unjust, part of what we have to do is to be disruptive in our opposition to them in order to change them. What you also heard about was Section 35. It's another visible law in the world. We hear about the litigation that Indigenous peoples have engaged in over the many decades that we've been doing it. So we're used to thinking about ourselves as having rights that will be enforced. In other words, we're used to thinking about ourselves as rights-bearing people. We know that they will be reinforced. So we're used to formal law in the world. It's normalized. It's familiar. It's visible, and its invisible manifestations are all around us. We don't always agree with what happens with that law, or how it's applied, or the kinds of legal decisions that we're either a part of or that we hear about. But what is important is that there be a legitimacy around it, that we have a sense of order. We need to be able to place ourselves in this order in order to make sense of our world. At least, and so that on a general basis we have an idea of what to expect in our world. There's also informal law, and that informal law is the backdrop. It's our understanding of law, and it's what enables us to see the formal law, to see the visible law, and to accept it. One of the things that John Burroughs said last night is that, at least I think this is what I heard him say, was that the law that we teach in law schools is it's a thin veneer. It's like tissue paper. And it would collapse without the informal understandings that enable us to hold up the formal law in the world. There are lots of contradictions with law. We hear about that. We hear about the kinds of injustices that law can perpetuate in its pursuit of justice. And one of the other things that John Burroughs has said is that law can be understood as having two stories in every situation. It's law that tells you that things are a certain way, and at the same time there's another story telling you about law in another way, and those are always going on. It's the life of law. So it enables argumentation, and we don't always agree with the outcomes, but we will abide by it if the processes are legitimate. So even when we're critical of the power dynamics that inform the law in our world, we'll uphold it because we believe in the aspirations of law and what it sets out to do about its possibilities in our world. So most often when we hear the word law, we think about Canadian law. So the questions that I asked you, probably most people were thinking about manifestations of state law. Now, imagine that the world that you know, that the law in the world that you know starts to disintegrate, to the point where you can no longer rely on it, where your rights and your protections won't be upheld. Maybe the ownership of your property will become in question. Maybe it'll be denied. What would happen to civility? What would happen to your sense of citizenry? Your sense of safety? Your ability to act on your sense of right and wrong? So this is what's happened to Indigenous law. Exactly this. It causes a profound sense of disorientation, a displacement, a loss of mooring about who we are as a peoples, as a family, and as individuals. So our communities experience the consequences of this. And we see some manifestations of violence. We see the undermining of Indigenous peoples as self-determining, as self-governing peoples, as peoples who are responsible for ourselves, for our law, for our governance, for our economies, and our social fabric. So that's the backdrop. It's some of the backdrop of movements like Idle No More. People participate in Idle No More for many different reasons, from their places of experience in the world. But Indigenous law hasn't gone anywhere. It exists in our community. It's been damaged, but it continues to exist in some formal ways as well as in informal ways. So informally, it determines our normative commitments, our sense of the right and the wrong. Informally, it informs our relationships, our obligations, with our relationships with one another and with non-human life forms. Formally, it exists in the kind of institutions that we're building and in the ways that we try and create a meaningful political relationship with Canada. I don't want to idealize the situation. This work of revitalizing Indigenous law means that we have to start with where we're at. And it means not underestimating the violence of colonialism on our law. Several legal scholars have argued that law is created, we create it as a human enterprise through serious and sustained commitment, through serious and sustained engagement. So what that also means is that a lack of serious and sustained engagement can begin to cause law to be undermined, to disintegrate. I don't think Indigenous laws have disintegrated entirely. They exist in various ways in our communities, some places only partially existing, some places undermined, but elements of it are still there, and you see people acting on it where they can. So what might this work of revitalizing Indigenous law mean today? So some of the work that I'm involved with, there's a couple of really big projects. One, as Robert has mentioned, is an Indigenous law degree program that I'm working along with this amazing faculty at the University of Victoria. So looking at how Indigenous law might be taught along with Canadian law through a combined dual degree program. So that's something that we're building. We also are establishing an Indigenous law research unit or clinic, and this is providing resources, working with communities, providing resources to communities, as well as providing resources for the Indigenous law degree program. So the national, I'm a part of directing a national research project. We're working with different societies, different communities across Canada. And we started with a question about, within the legal traditions of different peoples, what are the harms within societies? What are the kind of harms within groups and harms between groups? And we asked, we began looking at how those are manifested and how people understand those in different societies. And then we ask, what are the different legal responses to those harms, injuries, and conflicts in the different legal orders that we're working with? So there are many, many kinds of responses. There's compensation, there's sometimes reintegration, there's sometimes punitive measures. There's all different responses that people have in the different legal orders. And all of that is a part of Indigenous peoples managing themselves collectively, as a peoples, as societies. So I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit, but when thinking about revitalizing Indigenous law, the kinds of things that Indigenous communities need include accessible resources. The methodologies that we've been employing have been picked up by a number of communities who are working with it, applying the methodologies to substantively articulating child welfare law, substantively articulating and figuring out institutions for family law, figuring out how, in one situation, how Cree legal principles might inform the establishment of a native court. So people are taking up our work at the ground level and incorporating it into to deal with the contemporary challenges, the legal challenges that they're facing today. We also need, like in Indigenous communities, we need practical and critical literature. Indigenous communities don't need idealized and romanticized and simplified accounts of what our law is. And we need legal theory. We need different kinds of ways of thinking about law that enables us, that creates the space within which we can look at the contradictions in law and the challenges of it, and make sure that it's alive and that it's appropriate for the kinds of things that we have to deal with. So that idea of creating a theoretical space, that space to think about law, that's necessary for healthy societies, and it's necessary for healthy legal systems. Arguably, the kinds of things that I'm talking about insofar as Indigenous societies and what we need insofar as Indigenous law in order to make law truly reflective of intense democracy and citizenship in our societies is exactly what Canadians need to be doing with Canadian law. It's exactly the kind of work of citizenship. It doesn't just exist in our communities, it exists and is necessary beyond our communities. So part of this work is moving beyond the whys of Indigenous law to actually getting into the hows, getting into where we can think about application and actual engagement. So the methodologies, the way that we've been working is to draw on the intellectual resources within our societies, both the legal and the political resources, and it's these kinds of resources that will enable us to deal with the struggles and the difficulties that our communities are experiencing. So law, including Indigenous law, and all that it entails, is fundamental to being a peoples. It's fundamental to to being human. And Indigenous law is exactly about citizenship. It's exactly about governance. It includes safety and protection, and if it doesn't, it needs to. It includes providing tools for challenging internal and external power imbalances. And it includes building and maintaining decolonized relationships in our societies and with Canada. So the tools for the work that we've been doing, we've been drawing Indigenous law from stories. We've been exploring sources of Indigenous law. We've been looking at the functions of law. What does it do? And how does it enable us to think and to solve problems? We've been thinking about law's legitimacy, about its authorities, about accountability, and about how law changes over time. And it's hopeful work because it's about relations within our communities. It's about doing the work of managing ourselves as well as relating to other peoples. So we're creating resources, as I mentioned, for the Indigenous Law degree program, as well as resources that communities can use for different different kinds of goals that they have. So drawing law from stories, that's one of the methodologies, but there's other kinds of methodologies that can be used too. We use a way of analyzing stories that allow us to look at decision makers, that allow us to look at legitimate processes and so on. So we use that method, but there's other methods that we can use to learn from stories as well, such as linguistic methods and learning law from the land and so on. What matters is that that process, whatever process we're using to learn and to think about Indigenous law, is that it be collaborative, that it be critical, that we create opportunities for space and challenge around it, and that it's a way that where there are power balances, that's also a part of working with it. So we've been working with some Mi'kmaq communities, with Secwepemc communities, Tsilhqot'in communities, Inuit. We have been working with Inuit stories, not yet with Inuit communities, Métis, Cree, Anishinaabeg. So, and also with Tsleil-Waututh and Snuneymuxw here on the southern part of British Columbia. So we started looking at, as I mentioned, harms between and among Indigenous peoples and legal responses to that. We want to move the research on to looking at drawing from the stories and talking with people about law regarding lands and resources, with governance, with obligations or contracts, with business, with economies, families, and more work to do with harm. So we have lots of work that we want to do, and we want to be able to do that work with communities, and we want that work that we're doing with communities to inform how we teach law and how we build that Indigenous law degree program. So there are many expressions of law. You've heard some of them. You've heard some songs, you've heard some stories, there's dances, there's art, there's different kinds of formal and informal pedagogies. All of those are part of what Indigenous law is. And there's many different kinds of stories. You heard the origin story with John Eliot. You heard the stories of John Burroughs, of the red-tailed hawk, and about his dreams. There's other kinds of stories as well, and they exist all around us. And that's one way to think about law, and one way to think about learning and teaching law. What I would like to do is tell you a story. It won't take too long, but I have a couple of questions. You have some homework. One question, it will be, how does the story make you think? The second question, what does it enable you to think about? The third question, what conversations might be generated by the story? So this story is written by Velma Wallace. It's a compilation of her oral histories, the Gwich'in in northern Alaska. And I share the story because I want you to also think about the law in the story, as well as the different perspectives in the story. So it's from a book called The Two Old Women, which is my favorite book of all time, I think. In the ancient times, there was a small group of Gwich'in people. They were in the far north of Alaska. It was winter, and the food was scarce, and it had been scarce for a long time. In this group, there were two old women. They had really gotten into their role as old women. They really played it up. They complained all the time about their frailty. They could hardly walk, and they had to use canes. They weren't able to do any of the work, and they weren't contributing in any way. They grumbled about their age, their helplessness, their aches and their pains. They had to be waited on by everybody. One of these old women had a daughter and a grandson in the group, and the grandson loved his grandmother very much. Now the people were having trouble finding the caribou. Even rabbits were hard to find. There was very little game. The chief consulted with the other community leaders. The chief told the group that they told the people that they had decided to leave the 2 old women behind. No one opposed him, not even the daughter. She saw something dangerous in the eyes of the people, and she knew that starvation can cause people to do terrible things. The grandson was heartbroken. Before they left, he hid a hatchet, and he whispered to his grandmother where to find it. And the daughter hid some coals and some sinew and whispered to her mother where to find it. And then the people left. The 2 old women were completely devastated. They could hardly believe what had happened. They watched people walk away. Now the chief was not a hard man, and several times he almost turned back, but he kept going. The 2 old women found the coals, they made a small fire, they found the hatchet, and then they stayed in their tent, and they did nothing. Everything hurt, and they were getting weaker. The next day, they were still doing nothing, and all of a sudden they saw a squirrel. One of them remembered, she used to set traps for squirrels. So very slowly, they made a trap and they caught that squirrel, and they had a feast. The next day, they started walking around a little bit, slowly at first, and then they threw away their canes. They finally got to where they could do that. Then they were able to set some rabbit traps. They caught a rabbit, and then another one. They were able to walk a little bit more by now. They were able to use the rabbit furs. Little by little, they regained the use of their bodies. They dug in their memories, and they found survival skills. They stopped complaining. They helped one another. They started to get stronger. They were able to catch small game and to sew warm clothing for themselves. They moved camp because they were afraid the group would come back and they didn't know what to expect. The long winter passed slowly. Spring came. They were able to catch fish. They made a smokehouse and began to build up a store of food. Then they were able to kill a larger game, and they dried the meat and they made warm clothes. They became strong and confident, sure of themselves. They were skilled hunters and trappers and fishers. They picked berries and medicines. They collected lots of wood for winter. They built a fine camp, and they were women of wealth. They marveled at all their work and their activities. They were ashamed that they hadn't done anything for years because they allowed themselves to have become helpless. One day, while they were out hunting, they saw some people, and they hid and they watched. It was the group that left them behind. They were afraid, so they stayed hidden. They went back to their little camp, and they wondered what to do. Should they show themselves to the people? Should they remain hidden? But the old lady, she really wanted to see her grandson. So they decided to go and find the people and then figure out what to do. And they traveled and they found a group and they hid and they watched. The people in the group, they weren't doing so well. Their clothes were all raggedy, they were really skinny, and they were suffering. The 2 old women, they decided to approach the group. Everyone was so surprised. They thought the women were dead. The daughter and the grandson were overjoyed, and the chief was relieved. The 2 old women learned that the people had been surviving on very little, just small game, and they hadn't been able to find any big game or fish since they left the 2 old women behind. They were run down, and they were doing really poorly. The 2 old women talked to the chief and told him they had lots of food and lots of clothing to camp, and they would share with the group. But they told the chief they wanted to maintain their own camp. They didn't want to live with the group because they didn't yet trust them. This was agreed to. The 2 old women fed the people and provided them with warm clothing, but they stayed in a separate camp. Then the people began to find caribou, and they began to find fish, and they began to prosper again. So remember that stories are told thinking. They're tools for thinking. There are reasons that people told these stories for 10,000, 15,000 years. Now, I asked you to think about 3 questions as I was telling you the story. What did the story make you think? What did it make you think about? What are the possible conversations that the story might generate for you? What I'd like you to do is turn to the person next to you and just talk about those questions for a little minute. Research that we've done over this last year. And we're going to be continuing with this project of looking at what are all the different kinds of ways that we can get Cree law in the world in ways that are accessible, that are useful, that are practical, and which will generate important conversations with one another. So if you're able, put May 6th in your calendar. We'll feed you lunch and you'll have a really, really good time. And you'll look at our comic book and you will be amazed because it's truly wonderful. Thank you very much for your time.